The rain hammered against the windows of the military hospital as I sat alone in the corner of the waiting room, my hands still trembling, from the mission that had gone catastrophically wrong just hours before. Blood, not mine, still stained the edges of my uniform, and the screams of my fallen soldiers echoed in my mind like a symphony of failure. I was Captain Marcus Reid, a name that once commanded respect and fear across 3 continents, a man who had led over 50 successful operations without losing a single soldier. Until today. Until I had made the call that sent 3 of my best men into an ambush that I should have seen coming. The fluorescent lights above flickered as I stared at my hands, these same hands that had signed deployment orders, pulled triggers, and saluted at funerals. 22 years of service had carved me into something hard and unbreakable, or so I thought. I had built walls around myself so high that even my own family couldn't see over them anymore. My ex-wife had left 5 years ago, taking our daughter with her, saying she couldn't live with a ghost anymore. She was right. I was a ghost, haunting battlefields, haunting command centers, haunting my own life without ever really living in it. The medals on my chest felt heavier than body armor, each one representing a piece of my humanity I had traded for victory. I didn't notice her at first. The young nurse who approached me moved with a quiet confidence that seemed out of place in the chaos of the emergency wing. She couldn't have been more than 25, with warm brown eyes that held something I hadn't seen directed at me in years, genuine concern without fear, without that careful distance people kept from men like me. Her name tag read Sarah Chen, and when she knelt down in front of me, positioning herself at eye level rather than standing over me, something inside my chest tightened, in a way that had nothing to do with the panic attack I'd been fighting off for the past hour. "Captain Reid," she said softly, and there was no tremor in her voice, no hesitation. "I need you to come with me. Your men are asking for you." I wanted to tell her that I couldn't face them, that I had no right to stand at their bedsides after what I'd done. But before I could form the words, she did something that shattered every defense I had carefully constructed over 2 decades of military service. She reached out and took my hand, not with sympathy, not with pity, but with a firmness that suggested she wasn't asking. She looked directly into my eyes, past the rank insignia, past the hardened exterior, past everything I used to keep the world at bay, and said with absolute certainty, "You belong to me now. You're not carrying this alone anymore." Those 7 words, "You belong to me now," struck me with more force than any explosion I'd survived. I was a captain, a veteran, a man trained to lead and never follow, conditioned to bear burdens alone and never show weakness. But in that moment, with her hand wrapped around mine and those impossibly steady eyes holding my gaze, I felt something crack open inside me that I had kept sealed for so long I'd forgotten it existed. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the possibility of salvation, the first ray of light penetrating the darkness I'd been living in. She didn't wait for my permission or my protest. She simply pulled me to my feet and led me through the corridors, and I followed her like a man who had been wandering in the desert and finally glimpsed water. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of hospital rooms and difficult conversations. Sarah stayed with me through all of it, standing just slightly behind me as I faced my wounded soldiers, never intruding but always present. When Private Johnson, who had lost his leg below the knee, gripped my hand and told me it wasn't my fault, I nearly broke. When Sergeant Williams, his chest wrapped in bandages, managed a weak salute and said he'd follow me into hell again, I had to turn away to hide the tears that threatened to fall. And through it all, I could feel her presence like an anchor, keeping me grounded when everything inside me wanted to spiral away into guilt and self-destruction. After the last visit, when I finally walked out of that hospital room where Corporal Davis lay in a medically induced coma, his family sitting vigil beside him, I made it exactly 10 steps down the hallway before my legs gave out. I didn't fall. Sarah caught me, somehow anticipating my collapse before it happened, guiding me into an empty consultation room. And then, for the first time since I had joined the military at 18 years old, I broke. Not quietly, not with dignity, but with great heaving sobs that tore through me like shrapnel. I cried for the men I'd lost today, for all the men I'd lost over the years, for the family I'd destroyed in pursuit of being the perfect soldier, for the humanity I'd systematically dismantled in myself piece by piece until I became more machine than man. Sarah didn't say anything. She didn't offer empty platitudes or false reassurances. She simply held me, her arms wrapped around a man twice her size who was supposed to be unbreakable, and let me fall apart completely. When I finally had no tears left, when I sat there empty and raw and more vulnerable than I'd ever been in my entire life, she pulled back just enough to look at me again. "You're going to survive this," she said. And it wasn't a hope or a wish, it was a statement of fact. "But you're not going to do it by being Captain Reid. You're going to do it by being Marcus, whoever he is underneath all that armor, and I'm going to help you figure that out." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that there was no Marcus underneath, that I'd killed him years ago in service to my country and my career. I wanted to warn her that I was damaged beyond repair, that men like me didn't get happy endings, that she should run far away before I dragged her down into my darkness. But the words wouldn't come because some part of me, some small part I thought was dead, desperately wanted to believe her. So instead I just nodded and she smiled, not a wide, cheerful smile, but a small, knowing expression that suggested she understood exactly how hard this was going to be and had decided I was worth the effort anyway. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life, harder than combat, harder than losing men under my command, harder than any physical injury I'd ever sustained. The military opened an investigation into the failed operation, and though I was eventually cleared of negligence, the psychological weight of command, decisions that cost lives, doesn't disappear with an official report. I was offered counseling, which I initially refused, proud and stupid enough to think I could handle it alone. Sarah changed that. She didn't push, didn't force, didn't lecture. She simply showed up at my apartment every other day after her shifts, bringing food I wouldn't eat and sitting in silence I couldn't fill, making it clear through her steady presence that she meant what she'd said. I belonged to her now, and she wasn't going anywhere. Gradually, almost without noticing, I began to talk. Not about the mission, not about the tactical failures and command decisions, but about everything else. I told her about growing up with a father who valued toughness over tenderness, about joining the military to prove something to a man who died before I could earn his approval, about my daughter Emily, who was now 15 and barely knew me, about the version of myself I'd created that was so effective at war and so terrible at being human. Sarah listened to all of it without judgment, occasionally asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things I'd been avoiding for decades. She had this way of seeing through pretense that was both terrifying and liberating, like she possessed X-ray vision specifically designed to detect emotional bullshit. One evening, about 6 weeks after we'd met, she asked me what I was afraid of. We were sitting on my apartment balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the question came out of nowhere, catching me off guard. "Losing control," I answered honestly, surprising myself. "If I'm not Captain Reid, if I let myself feel everything I've been pushing down, I'm afraid I'll fall apart completely and never be able to put myself back together." She was quiet for a long moment, then said something that changed everything. "Marcus, you're not falling apart. You fell apart in that hospital corridor, remember? This is you putting yourself back together piece by piece. It's just that this time, you're building something real instead of something bulletproof." She was right, of course. The process of healing wasn't destruction. It was reconstruction. And slowly, so slowly I barely noticed it happening, I began to change. I started attending therapy sessions with a veterans counselor who specialized in command trauma. I reached out to my ex-wife, not to rekindle anything, but to apologize for the emotional absence that had poisoned our marriage, and to ask if I could try to be a real father to Emily. I visited my wounded soldiers regularly, not as their commanding officer checking on assets, but as the man whose decisions had changed their lives, owing them presence and acknowledgement and whatever support I could offer. And through it all, Sarah was there, not as a romantic interest, though I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about it, but as something more essential, a witness, a tether, a reminder that I was still human. The moment everything shifted between us came on a cold Tuesday night 3 months after we'd met. I'd just returned from a particularly difficult therapy session where I'd had to relive the ambush in detail, walking through every decision, every second, every what-if that haunted me. I was exhausted, emotionally wrung out, and when I got home to find Sarah already in my apartment, I'd given her a key weeks earlier, needing to know she could come and go as she pleased. I nearly broke down again. She was cooking dinner, something simple and comforting, and the domestic normalcy of the scene was almost too much to bear. "I don't deserve this," I said from the doorway. "I don't deserve you showing up, taking care of me, believing in me. I led men to their deaths. Sarah, I made a mistake that cost lives and futures," and she turned off the stove and walked over to me, with that same steady confidence she'd shown in the hospital. "Stop," she said firmly. "Stop punishing yourself for being human. You made a call with the information you had. It went wrong. That's not the same as being unworthy of care or connection or a second chance." Then her expression softened, and she reached up to touch my face with a gentleness I still wasn't used to. "You keep saying you don't deserve things, like you need to earn the right to be treated with basic human kindness. But Marcus, that's not how this works. You're not a perfect soldier anymore. You're a broken man trying to heal. And I'm not here because you deserve it or earned it. I'm here because I choose to be. Because when I look at you, I don't see a flawed commander. I see someone brave enough to feel everything he's been taught to suppress. That's who you belong to now, the version of yourself that's allowed to be scared and sad and uncertain. And that version belongs to me because I claimed him in that hospital, and I'm not giving him back. If the story so far has touched something in your heart, if you've ever felt the weight of your own armor or known someone struggling beneath the surface of their strength, I want to ask you something. Please take just a moment to like this video, to share it with someone who might need to hear it, or to leave a comment about a time when someone showed up for you when you felt most alone. Your engagement helps these stories reach others who need them, and in a world that often rewards hardness over healing, we need to remind each other that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the most courageous thing we can offer. The tears came again, but this time they were different. Not the violent, destructive sobs of that first breakdown, but something quieter, cleaner, like a wound finally being washed out. I pulled her close, wrapping my arms around her and holding on like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world. And in many ways she was. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered into her hair. "I don't know how to be this person you seem to think I can be." I felt her smile against my chest. "Lucky for you," she said, "I'm a nurse. I specialize in helping people recover from things they didn't think they'd survive. And you, Marcus Reid, are going to recover. You're going to become someone your daughter is proud to know. You're going to forgive yourself eventually. You're going to learn that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about allowing yourself to break and then having the courage to heal." The path forward wasn't easy or quick. I had moments of backsliding, days when the guilt crashed over me like a wave, and I retreated into old patterns of emotional shutdown. There were nightmares that woke me in cold sweats, therapy sessions that left me feeling worse before they made me better, and conversations with Emily that were awkward and painful as we tried to build a relationship from the ruins of my neglect. But through all of it, Sarah's words echoed in my mind like a promise and a challenge. "You belong to me now." Not in a possessive way, but in a way that suggested I'd been claimed by the possibility of healing, by the reality of human connection, by the radical idea that maybe, just maybe, I could be both a man who had made terrible mistakes and a man worthy of love. 6 months after that rainy night in the hospital, I attended Corporal Davis's welcome home ceremony. He'd woken from his coma after 5 weeks and gone through 3 additional surgeries, but he was alive and recovering. When I approached him in his wheelchair, surrounded by his family, I didn't know what to say, but he looked up at me with clear eyes and said, "Captain, you visited me every week I was unconscious." My wife told me, "You read to me, talked to me, stayed with my family. That's not what a man who doesn't care does. That's what a man who loves his soldiers does." His words broke something open in me, but this time, instead of collapsing, I stood tall and let the emotion wash through me without drowning in it. Sarah stood beside me, her hand finding mine naturally, and I realized that this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of people who help you carry it. Later that night, as we walked through the park near my apartment, Sarah asked me how I was feeling. I thought about it carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer. "I feel like I'm learning to be human again," I told her. "Like there's this person emerging who's been buried under Captain Reid for so long. I forgot he existed. He's messier, more emotional, more uncertain about everything, but he's also more real." more present, more alive. She squeezed my hand, and in that simple gesture, I felt the full weight of what she'd given me. Not solutions or answers, but the space to fall, apart, and the support to rebuild myself into something authentic. Before I finish this story, I want to ask you to do something for me. In the comments below, write just 2 words. I believe. Because whether you're someone who needs to hear this message, or someone who has been Sarah for someone else, or someone who is trying to figure out how to be both strong and human at the same time, I need you to know that I believe in your capacity to heal, to change, to become whoever you're meant to be beneath the armor. Write I believe if you think kindness matters, if you think broken people can be whole again, if you think the bravest thing we can do is let someone see us completely and trust that we won't be rejected. Write it for yourself, for someone you know who's struggling, or for every person who has ever felt like they were too damaged to deserve love. Your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to see today. As I stood in that park with Sarah beside me, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, I realized that she'd been right that very first night. I did belong to her now, not because she owned me, but because she'd seen me at my absolute worst and decided I was worth saving. She'd looked at a feared veteran, captain who thought he was beyond redemption, and said with absolute certainty, "You belong to me," claiming not my strength or my accomplishments or my rank, but my broken, hurting, authentic self. And in doing so, she'd given me permission to belong to myself again, to reclaim the humanity I'd sacrificed in pursuit of being unbreakable. The journey wasn't over. Healing never really is, but for the first time in 22 years, I wasn't walking it alone. I had someone who saw through the armor to the man underneath, and she'd chosen to stay. That, I was learning, was what love actually looked like. Not fireworks or grand gestures, but steady presence in the darkness, and a hand that refused to let go even when you tried to push it away. I was Captain Marcus Reid, a man who had made mistakes and carried scars and would spend the rest of his life trying to be better. But more importantly, I was just Marcus, learning slowly and painfully to be human again, one day at a time, one moment of vulnerability at a time, one act of courage at a time. And that, I was finally beginning to understand, was enough.